Impact investing is simply investments made into companies or organizations with the intent to contribute to measurable positive social or environmental impact alongside financial returns. Impact investing and investing in Africa have become synonymous in many ways. At its heart, done with professional delivery, accountability, and intent, what you have is an approach to investing capital in our economies in a way that builds resilience and inclusivity. Our investments, therefore, build access and prosperity in a way that they otherwise would not. Some see this as a good thing. That is, you can raise capital from more investors. Some see it as a handicap. That is, you can only raise capital from investors who can be seen to be wanting non-commercial outcomes. Africa has long been a leader in business and society incorporating impact naturally into consideration. We cover in this module the practicalities of 5 things. The first is what it technically means to be an impact investor. The second is the effect this has on fundraising. The third is the opportunities to use blended finance when investing in portfolio companies. The fourth is developing a valid impact thesis and measurement. The fifth is driving impact value creation. However, what we would dearly like you to think through is the pros and the cons of what it means to be an impact investor, how it affects what you want to project for your fund. If you go forward with considering yourself an impact investor, we hope you will leave this module feeling like you are clear on strategic positioning as well as operational delivery of impact through your investments. Welcome to the module on impact investing. This is presented by Basil Nunwe and myself, Geetha Dhammaratnam. We have split this module into 2. Part 1 is about an introduction to impact investing. Part 2 goes into a lot more detail and the nuts and bolts of actually deploying and managing capital. Impact investing is an area that Africa has taken a lead on and has really shown this from 3 perspectives: from its regulatory environment, from innovation, and from the implementation, meaning the way in which capital has been deployed. However, that said, this has been a journey. The entire space has undertaken a journey from ESG, environmental, social, and governance, being considered impact investing, to responsible investing, to sustainable investing, to corporate social responsibility, and now the emergence in the last 10 years of a separate, well-defined field called impact investing. This version of impact investing is one where what we're trying to introduce are more concepts around accountability and clarity, so that what we are doing is establishing funds, raising funds, which are truly accountable and which are representing investing opportunities on the continent in a way that we think is making sense. So the definition of impact investing, according to the IFC, is impact investing is investments made into companies or organizations with the intent to contribute to measurable positive social or environmental impact alongside financial returns. The operating principles were coalesced by the IFC and other investors a few years ago. And it's very helpful to be able to separate out those who talk about impact as being extremely generic from those who are truly impact investors, who have got embedded at the heart of their strategy, impact accountability. There are 5 elements to the IFC impact operating principles. The first is that there is strategic intent. That means that you as a fund manager are defining what the strategic impact objectives are and how they're consistent with the investment strategy that you have put in place. The second point is that you are managing the strategic impact on a portfolio basis. Not just deal by deal, but across all deals. Under origination and structuring, it's a second element here. Point 3 is you need to establish your contribution to the achievement of the impact that you have said you wish to have. Point 4 is you want to assess what the expected impact is systematically, so that you are not measuring things differently, investment by investment. The 5th is that you are going to assess, address, monitor, and manage potential negative impacts of each investment. This particular point has come to being to address the issues of negative externalities. When you make an investment, you're responsible and accountable for all the impact that business is having, whether good or bad. The third element of the operating principles is portfolio management. This is about ensuring you are monitoring the progress of each investment in achieving the impact goals and KPIs that you have set against them and responding appropriately. In that regard, impact management is no different to any other element of portfolio management after you have invested in the company. At exit, the fourth element of the operating principles is about how you address two things. The first is your choice of exit, how you are considering what the exit is going to be and the effect on sustaining the impact that you have developed in this business, together with the entrepreneur. The second element to take into account at exit is documentation, where you review and document the information and the decisions that you have taken. And it's helpful to understand what the lessons learned have been. The fifth element here is independent verification. If you decide to sign up to the IFC Impact Operating Principles, it is an indicator to other investors that you are being systematic and strategic about how you are embedding impact into your fund. This point around independent verification is really speaking to a regular verification of the alignment of your business to the impact strategy that you say that you are putting in place. This entire space is very much one which started with a lot of narrative, started with a lot of images, and images which may not have been closely related to the real impact of these businesses. As you move forward, our hope is that you are taking an approach which is rooted in a very clear sense of accountability as to what impact you wish to have, how you hold yourself responsible to achieve that impact, how you report on it, and that you actually execute on it. Blended financing is a space that has also grown, especially in the last 8 years. Blended financing is talking about how you bring elements of investors who have differing requirements in terms of the returns that they wish to have. Inevitably, they are also seeking increasing amounts of impact as a result of the low return they're willing to take. So you have the ability, when you put your fund together, to think about how you want to bring investors together, because not all investors are going to want the same level of quote unquote commercial returns. So you have the ability to catalyze private sector investments, especially in underserved sectors in low and middle income countries, by bringing in development financing. And that's not just the development finance institutions. This is moving further into other impact investors who are not looking often for high commercial returns, but are clear on usually their systematic impacts that they're seeking. That might be gender related, it might be sector related, it even might be region related. So if you're able to align those interests, it gives you an alternative approach to being able to raise capital for the strategy that you wish to have. It is a little bit dangerous to try and raise capital based on where you think the money can come from. The better thing to do is to ensure you have a robust strategy. And that is especially the case when it comes to impact investing. Have a robust strategy around how you intend to achieve the impact you wish to achieve, and then find investors who are naturally aligned with that. And when you're looking at that, there are three elements that you should also look at, which is along the capital stack. This is equity, debt, and guarantees. There are some investors on the impact side who are happy to bring in guarantees, and this allows you to unlock other forms of capital. When you're making the investments, usually you will have a blend of equity investments and some debt-based instruments. You have the ability again to think about how to blend, not just at your fund level, but also on the deal by deal level. And this is all about making sure that you are bringing together the objectives and incentives of various investors to be aligned with the outcomes that you're seeking with the strategy that you have in place. When you're thinking about investing along the spectrum of capital, you actually want to look at things from below market rate investments to what are considered to be market rate investments. It's clearly not this well defined. However, it's an interesting framework for you to consider how you can match the impact that you're expecting to have and the results on the kind of returns you may or may not get. The reason being, often high impact strategies tend to be focused on markets where there are people who are underserved, or it is addressing a situation where essential goods and services of a particular nature are not being produced. And so they may be inherent to the business strategy a higher degree of risk, a higher degree of cost, which may be part of what is contributing to the lower expected returns. And so you want to match that kind of strategy to the kind of instruments that you're using from the capital stack in the deals that you're doing. But on a fund level, whilst we've just talked about blending, you also want to think about the impact this is going to have on the outcomes that you're seeking from a financial perspective, as well as from an impact perspective. The bottom half of this screen will show you a dynamic which has become largely accepted by the impact investing community to differentiate between investors who are considered to be financial only versus those who are considered to be impact only. For most impact investors, you are somewhere in the middle, and that is you are integrating environmental, social, and governance as a process and moving beyond that integration to pursue specific outcomes. And you are focusing on measurable high impact solutions. It's helpful to think this through for yourselves as you're developing your strategy in the first instance, to see where you land and get comfortable with the language that is associated with the space in which you've landed. The impact investment space, as I had mentioned earlier, has largely, especially over the early part of this sector growing in Africa, has largely been based on narrative. And that can put a lot of people off. That can put a lot of investors off and fund managers off who don't want to be associated with that. It is, however, an opportunity, especially the space as it is evolving now, for you to think about practically what this means for the outcomes that you're seeking. The size of the impact market is growing. It is growing incredibly. The establishment of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals in 2015 has helped to escalate that growth because it's given everybody a similar yardstick by which to understand and effect change. Within sub-Saharan Africa, in 2017, the impact investment market was estimated to be about 12% of global assets under management. By 2020, it was 11%, but global assets under management had also significantly increased. So there is an opportunity in terms of aligning the strategy, in terms of what you're seeking to effect as change, as more inclusive economic growth as a start, aligning it with incentives and imperatives that investors are utilizing in when they're thinking about how to allocate capital. So if you can bring those two halves together, it can be quite fulfilling. The measurement of impact has been very difficult. It's like trying to find the Holy Grail because it's hard to get consistency where every impact investor is measuring impact in the same way that every investor is analyzing the financial statements of a business. It will take time for us to get to something where everybody is using it. Until then, there is flexibility in the way that you're measuring impact, which is why the more transparent you are about how you're measuring impact and being specific about the impact being linked directly to the businesses that you're investing in, all of that will increase the visible accountability that you have when you consider yourself to be an impact investor. The Global Impact Investing Network is the global body for this industry and have got a tremendous amount of resources available on their website about measurement of impact. They're not the only ones. There's also the Impact Management Project, which is worth looking at. However, at the end of the day, you need to be able to translate that to the specific strategy that you have developed for your fund, and to ensure that what you are developing as a measurement system and approach is, one, not too complicated, two, is something which can be integrated throughout your investment process, three, is something directly linked. So you are measuring the thing that your business that you've invested in is actually producing. And four, you want to ensure that you are learning from the data that's coming back. You can show movement, either up or down, adjusted by the potential negative effects of the investment as well. Many impact investors value impact measurement and management, not only for impact reasons, but also because of the market intelligence it gives you. So from a commercial perspective, knowing who your customers are in a portfolio company, knowing what is driving their decisions, knowing what matters to them, will inevitably help the business better understand its own operations and adjust their strategy and route to market. As I mentioned earlier, you do indeed want to consider the impact data at every stage of the investment process. When you're doing your due diligence initially, you might want to have an inherent impact rating. What that means is, for example, if you're investing in a hospital, we know that this business is having impact. However, that needs to be separated from the impact value add that you feel you might be able to effect. And you want to start digging those apart at the due diligence stage. At the investment screening stage, when you're going and having the discussions with your investment committee, you want to bring out what the KPIs are. What are the indicators that you can put in place to assess the value add that you're going to bring through your impact activities? And you want to put this from an operational perspective as well. You want to identify any social or environmental needs, and you want to design the investment or the portfolio strategy to be aligned with your initial fund strategy. As you're managing these investments on a deal by deal basis, you will remember from the IFC operating principles that one of the elements of the operating principles is making sure you're systematically embedding the impact across the entire portfolio that you have and throughout the investment management period. At exit, you want to do a final review. And this is interesting because you can almost review it relative to the point at which you initially invested and see what the net impact has been of your activities. Post-exit, there's very little that you'll be able to do because you have exited the business. But it is nice to obviously look back and see how the business is doing subsequently. We wanted to make this a little bit more practical for you. So here's an example we'll work through in terms of an impact-oriented strategy. In this case, what we're talking about is a fund, which is intending to invest in healthcare, focused on increasing access, affordability, and quality of healthcare to low-income individuals across the continent. This fund's impact thesis is what you're seeing on the screen right now. It is to increase access, increase affordability, increase quality of healthcare. The target populations are low-income individuals. The definition around low-income individuals is something that you need to get comfortable with. You might want to put this relative to income levels that are within your country. You might want to put this relative to income levels which are generally accepted. For example, the base of the pyramid or the bottom of the base of the pyramid being those who are making less than $1,000 on a purchasing power parity adjusted basis per year. The BOP are those who are making usually up to $3,000 on a purchasing power parity adjusted basis per year. So understanding those whose lives you intend to affect is a part of what you need to take into account in your impact-oriented strategy. There are program-related investors out of the US who may have very clear definitions of who they consider to be those they can define as impacted through their activities. So you also need to be aware of those nuances and work with those nuances. In this case, The strategy might be, on the quality side, looking at three things. How is clinical quality going to improve in the healthcare businesses after you've invested? Are you going to get more clinical governance in place? What is the patient perception? Do patients coming into this hospital, for example, that you have invested in, feel like the quality of the healthcare they're getting has improved? A third element of this might be around the structure and process of quality. And this is more internally focused and therefore allowing for the business to scale because the structure and process of quality within the healthcare facility has been improving and becoming systematic. You are able to maintain that same quality standard as you increase the number of premises perhaps this hospital has. On the affordability side, that you would imagine is quite straightforward. It is very much about pricing. Has it fundamentally become cheaper than alternatives? And many alternatives are priced between either what is in the healthcare space available through the public system and that which is available through usually a pretty expensive private system. So where are you in that spectrum? The context matters. The perception of the pricing, again, is another aspect of this. This becomes quite interesting if you're thinking about bundling services, so that perhaps what you are bringing is an element of health insurance together with the first 12 months of care that a woman needs after she has given birth. So how are you able to change the perception of affordability and keep linking it back to your focus of the fund, which is increasing access, affordability, as well as quality? What you may want to look at from the access side is timelines. Are people able to access healthcare services that your investment is able to provide at a faster pace than they would have otherwise? Has the catchment area increased? Are you able to reach with this business through your investment activities a wider area than they otherwise would have? This is particularly important, especially because many hospitals are really funnels, and the ability to deploy healthcare in communities without having the communities come into the hospitals is a tried and tested mechanism for us to understand the path to getting more people better quality healthcare. The final thing again here is again the perception of access. Perception is a big part of what influences a patient's quality of care. And therefore, in this case, your impact-oriented strategy might have perception linked to all three: access, quality, and affordability. Then you bring it down to one more level, which is what are the specific metrics you think you can collect and measure? And which of these metrics can be included within the operating procedures of the hospital? What may surprise you is most of what we've just discussed is what should anyways be collected through the operations of the hospital, especially if these hospitals have got any sort of certifications in place, including the hospital certification, COSASA or JCI.
Part 2 of this module is a discussion around impact, positioning, and execution. The section is comprised of 3 slides, where I'll dwell a little bit about the contents of each slide when I get to those sections. The first slide is going to look at the impact in the deal life cycle. The second slide will look at the governance and impact of investment decision-making. The third slide is an execution on impact value creation. Just to put some place markers into your head so you get a good understanding of what it is that Geetha has been talking about in the early part of the section, I want to put into your minds just 3 place markers. The evolution of impact in the investment space originally, I would say, started off under ESG, where the PE firms around the world were focused primarily on risk mitigation and trying to manage environmental and social governance issues. And as that evolved, companies that were responsible at looking at ESG properly would then try and do CSR projects, which are projects were not necessarily related to the environmental and social operations of the business, but put contributions back into local communities. The mining companies did a lot of this. And now, which is what the framework we're talking about, has a heavy emphasis on impact. And the three place markers I want to put in your mind is think of these three pockets as parts of a Venn diagram. On the left, you have your ESG, and on the right-hand side, you've got impact, and above it, you've got CSR. Somewhere in there, in between those circles, there's a confluence, and you get to understand why the more you think deeply as to what's associated with them. First place marker. The second one I want to sort of flag is roughly the elements that Geetha pointed on. The discussion in the IFC definition of impact investment makes specific point that you're looking at positive impact movement, which clearly tells you that there's negative impacts as well. And it is your responsibility then to manage the negative impacts as make sure at the same time as you're trying to develop positive impacts. Also, something else I want to add in your place marker and your thinking is that the approach to which you'll have this impact discussion, especially measurement and reporting, goes beyond operational, impacts generated by the operations. In other words, you got direct impacts and you've got indirect impacts. Indirect impacts will probably cover spectrums that include your supply chain. So you should then be looking at, well, what is it in the supply chain that has a consequence in terms of impact? A very quick example in that regard is if you're doing a business that's in waste management, if you focus entirely on your revenue generating side of the operation, on finished product that comes out of the business that does the recycling and transformation, you miss the opportunity that you can actually rate this business as a high impact business because of what it does on the bottom side, on the supply side in terms of waste, which could include all sorts of waste that's being processed for recycling. With that background in mind, I think one more line in that regard is issue around the fact that you're looking at impact. Bear in mind that like any other aspect of your investment life cycle, whether it's you doing financial modeling, the legal documentation, and running the business, is that it's dynamic. There is nothing static. When you start from the very beginning, from your due diligence process, it seems static, but as you go forward, you'll find that it may not be what you intended, but your role really as investment managers is to evolve, adapt, and fit into as best as you can as to what's happening in the market, which means basically, if you've created an environment, a value creation plan at day one, it is not inconceivable that halfway through the life of your investment that you may have to revisit that. Other opportunities come on board that create other value creation opportunities going forward, which therefore means you must have active involvement. A lot of rumbling in that first section, but if I go straight specifically to the slide now, you will see that in the slide, there's 6 parts to the life cycle process. Some people have 2 or 3, but most of the time you find that these are nested in any event. Your first phase really looks at investment screening. This is before you've actually provided any capital into the business where you do a review. In most instances, this will include what's called negative screening. Your LPs or other partners might prescribe to you what kind of investments you can do and cannot do. This negative screening in itself is a significant part of the process because the screening itself is derived from trying to avoid you putting investments into areas that are extremely dangerous or hazardous and have been literally excluded off the list by a number of LPs. This will also include you making an assessment of the inherent ratings of the business. This is not quite as simple as it is. The idea of inherent rating of a business really is to say, are you getting into a business that already has got a decent impact card score on it? And you could invest in this business and do nothing, and the business would continue on its health. But the reality is you want to be able to add value. If you're putting the capital in there for growth, you should be able to then probably work and define what's called a baseline. You look to measure what those indices are and a starting point. So as you deploy capital going forward, you monitor the progress and the impact of what your capital has done by exponentially improving those impacts that you've identified. The second phase, which is really the due diligence, is an in-depth analysis of your impacts in there. As you do your financial and other commercial due diligence, you do the same thing for impact. And it will focus primarily on managing risk, assessing what sort of risk could be there, both positive, impacts both positive and negative, and what mitigants you might be able to do in there. It's also an opportunity to start trying to establish what are the KPIs. Again, this is not extremely simple and straightforward, the whole discussion on establishing KPIs, courtesy of what's happened in the rest of the world, is there's been a number of players that have put together reporting frameworks that would help you literally understand and navigate what sort of KPIs would speak to what kind of impacts. To give you an example, in this area, you could literally start by looking at impact categories. What categories are you looking to target? And this is obviously on an investee by investee basis. You know, is it going to be in agriculture? Is it biodiversity in the ecosystem? Is it diversity and inclusion that you're looking at? Is it education? Is it employment? Is it energy? Is it health? I mean, Geetha made reference to a health example there. Is it land? Is it pollution? Is it waste? So there's a whole host of matrices that you can establish at the due diligence stage. The ideal thing is not to cover, I think, entire spectrum, as it becomes difficult to manage, but is to select the ones that are most pertinent, that you'll be able to measure, you know, and track. You would at this stage also be having a conversation with your investee companies to get their buy-in as to what should be measured. Bear in mind, going ahead, we're going to look at a position where now you're preparing legal documentation to make these obligations contractual. In that instance, so engaging with your partners, your potential partner companies and sponsors is important, so that you get their buy-ins as to what can be tracked and what can be monitored positively going forward. The third looks at the needs, impact needs analysis. And here you try and define the value creation plan. And if we go back to the little summary I gave you at the beginning, the whole idea is to say, look, you're not looking at risk mitigation, because the risk mitigation scenario looks at value preservation. You're now going beyond value preservation, and you're now looking at how can you actually improve the value in the business. The value creation plan, therefore, is something that you need to detail in there, and it'll speak quite easily, I think, if you're doing expansion capital in most of your operations. At this point, you'll have done your initial inherent ratings. At this point, you'll have also now gotten clear indication of what the key impacts are, and therefore you have greater visibility on what your final impact ratings are. So typically on the rating discussion, again, this is something that's probably not as easy and as straightforward as anyone would say. You could have different frameworks on how to rate your impacts. Typically, you would have elements that are verbal. So you could say for a business that has no impact at all, you have a verbal narrative that says none. On the other extreme, you'd have one that's got really high impact, and you probably classify it as very high. And in between, you have a spectrum. So you'd have small, medium, and high. And you could either use numerical numbers to try and do that, or letter alphanumeric numbers to be able to do that. Again, no full consensus on who's doing what, as long as it's clear in your documentation on how you intend to do it. That way you'll be able to be measured on it and monitor it correctly. The next step was around your legal documentation. Your legal documentation will cover the issues around impact and trying to make sure that the agreements that you have are contractual. You do the same thing for your ESG. You try and do the same thing for impact. You may run into challenges in this area. I mean, we've seen this before on ESG, where your potential partners think it's additional costs associated with tracking and monitoring the matrices, additional cost in trying to deploy, or they don't have the resources to be able to track this. This becomes problematic. There are options. You may be able to get TA from your LPs if there is that opportunity, or to go back to the discussion that Geetha had with you a little earlier, you may be able to do co-investments with people who can provide blended financing if the economics don't quite work. So you could then, in that case, be able to incorporate these provisions into the legal documentation without necessarily getting the partners excited. So something else to look out for. Bear in mind that this should always be systematic. You must always try and put the documentation together. And if you start with the baseline, like we discussed in your early screening stage in your due diligence, it makes the track going forward a whole lot easier and more constructive. The post-investment value creation is probably the biggest part of any PE business's monitoring section. This is the part where you've deployed your capital now, and now you're having to monitor it. What I've found is extremely useful is to have the investment team, or one or two of the members of the investment team, get involved in the exco of the company. So you become part of the executive committee. So you're involved in the routine meetings on the operations, which then look at your financial operations. In this case, you'd probably have an ESG committee. You'd have a ESG and impact committee rather, which is something that helps you monitor. This way, you'll be able to track your remedial action plans, if there are any that you picked up of due diligence. You'll be able to track your value creation plans. And it's also a huge opportunity for you to be hands-on, to be able to see, is there any other opportunity that the business is in the life of the investment that the business comes across that you'll be able to add value? Is there a CSR opportunity where you can start putting money outside? The CSR one is particularly interested. I flag an example of a boutique operation, a boutique hotel operation that procures the artwork from scrap metal and all sorts of waste in the local market. So the impact of that obviously is clear as there's a waste cleanup operation, but it's taking artisans, local artisans, to create art, and they're coupled with design specs to create the furnishing and soft finishes for this facility. If you see it, I mean, it's absolutely remarkable. And what they've done in a number of instances, they've set up small businesses, literally not just to supply the requirements of the boutique chain of hotels, but they start to retail these into the residential properties and offices for various premises. So the impact goes back into the supply chain discussion I was talking about earlier, which I think is a good example on that. So good way to use the value creation module in those excos to be able to see how you can monitor and move forward. The final stage is impact and post-exit. Again, to be able to assess the impact you've had. If you've got a baseline, it makes a great story for you to be able to write something in your brag book. Why is it important? You will be raising a second fund or a third fund. To be able to showcase what you've done, will be a good place to be able to get more people attracted into putting capital into your second or third fund. And because the documentation helps you articulate the impact or value. The next slide covers a little bit about the element that we talked about in the governance. So your data collection is absolutely key. So you've identified your KPIs. Those KPIs, you can start off with rather broad objective at the top, but underlying those broad objectives at the bottom is granular detail. So you go down to the absolute lowest level of abstraction to get data. So you work with your PE partners to be able to collect the data at the grassroots level and be able to consolidate that into a theme. So that's particularly key. So the investment team is responsible for data collection, but it's also your partner company. And since you're involved in the exco, that goes a long way. Then you do your reviews with your executive committee, which assesses what's coming out of the team and the data on the ground. It gives feedback to the teams for recommendations to the committee, and you may even get a link back from the feedback on the teams that goes back to data collection that might inform the whole process that you could add or tweak additional data, almost in a systematic loop form to be able to do that. Then your fourth stage in that is now looking at the reporting and feedback loop. The reporting requirements when you're doing it for external parties, as Geetha mentioned, there's a whole host of opportunities where you could try and do this. In my mind, I can think of probably 10 platforms that are online that you could run to. IMP is one, Iris is one, which is linked to GIN. You have EchoDesk, you've got G17 Echo, you've got SoftSpot. So rather than, again, this is really an opportunity for any of the players to do, rather than try and reinvent the wheel from scratch, which is absolutely admissible, you could do that. You could actually take a look at any of these online platforms. Some of them are free and they don't require a high level of sophistication in order to operate them. Most of them rank from low to medium skill set in order to operate them. If you fish those out, you may find that from the very beginning, you might be able to find one that works well. And some of them are more preferred by LPs, but again, this is a discussion that's open-ended at this stage. But it will help definitely with the reporting. You do a data capture. It'll help with the identification of KPIs. It'll help with the granular detail of what other sub-matrices you'll be able to collect to speak to the top holding KPI. So the reports are then prepared and you identify areas of improvement, and you can track this literally in the long term, and it helps speak to your brag book towards the end of your investment period, in fact, at the end of the fund life. The last slide looks at impact value creation. And this is derived primarily out of a study that was done by GIN, where 60% of the respondents to the study confirmed that they like to collect the data primarily because the data was valuable for the businesses. And the key drivers that they identified was revenue growth. Already, Geetha mentioned this a little earlier, the fact that you can get to know and understand your customers will speak volumes on how you can direct, repackage, diversify your product mix to be able to improve your revenue. The bottom side of that, which is not necessarily volume directly, you could argue that perhaps there's a discussion around gross margin. Is there something in your supply chain that you could work and have impact that will be able to increase your gross margin on a cost control side on that end? The second cog looks at the operational effectiveness. And again, it's the social environmental performance. Data is collected to improve operational effectiveness. Here you can have issues like energy conservation, which would be absolutely powerful in being able to bring savings into the equation. You could also have closed loop water systems if it's a manufacturing facility, so you're not wasting any water. You're having to recycle it in specific areas like that. You could get into photovoltaic operations as solutions that you can put in there. You could get wind solutions to be able to do that. So operational effectiveness is another very big one on energy efficiency. The third cog is investment decisions. The investment decisions also related to investment decisions, including deal targeting, selection, and sourcing. The whole idea of investment decisions is that you've positioned yourself as an impact fund. You need to be able to make decisions with that criteria in the back of your mind. And this is just one among all the other cogs. It's the financial considerations, it's the social and environmental considerations. So this helps speak to that. The fourth silo, which is probably in my mind quite vital, is the reputation building. The fact that you're doing impact monitoring and controlling this, essentially you're looking at sustainability. To me, to use Geetha's words, this is a license to operate. Essentially, you're helping stakeholders, you're helping the community, and everybody else in the chain and the ecosystem benefits from the operation of the business. This, in the end, to speak to the last section, speaks to the strategic alignment and risk mitigation. This is key to speak to the idea of you raising a second and follow-on fund. And I'm looking at this in the context of your LPs. If you're able to demonstrate this, then you're definitely aligned with a lot of the impact LPs that are looking to provide capital into this particular space.